Hi Siobhan, this is a recording of the assessment of your mock exam that you completed recently. As you can see from the scheme here, you have scored all 4 marks for question number 1, so that's a good start, well done. So if we move on now to look at question 2, and you've scored 3 out of 8. If we look at the mark scheme for question 2 and we look at level 2 initially, we can see that it says that it shows some understanding of language, so attempts to comment on the effect of language, select some appropriate textual detail and make some use of subject terminology, mainly appropriately. And we see here that we're talking about descriptive writing in the text to set the scene. The way it's written is quite dramatic. The dramatic effect comes from using verbs such as tremble. So here we've got some terminology and an example. And your comment is that it makes it interesting to read. I like this second paragraph here where you say you feel the storm is strong and unpredictable, and you give the example of the wind came in gusts and shaking the coach. You've given a very good explanation of how it makes you feel scared for the character's safety. But you've not actually mentioned what terminology has been used there, so you would lose marks for that. You've also mentioned the constant rain with his numb fingers and cold and the wet, but again, you've not mentioned the terminology, which detracts from it a little. You've gone on to talk about the sentence structure, which is good, that is used as complex and compound sentences. However, you need to write about how it's making you feel rather than just saying that it makes it more interesting. You need to actually explain what the words make you feel like, what can you see, why do you think the writer has used those particular words, what is the effect that the writer is trying to create for you, the reader. So if we go back to the mark scheme, I think we can only give it 3 out of 4 because there's been some attempts to comment on the effect of the language, some appropriate textual detail and a very little use of the subject terminology. You've just mentioned verbs really and a little bit of sentence structure. So to gain the higher marks you need to be giving more terminology and more explanation of how it's making you feel, not just that it's making the writing more interesting. Moving on to question 3, the mark scheme again says show some understanding of structural features for level 2 and attempts to comment on the effect of the structural features and select some appropriate examples, make some use of subject terminology, mainly appropriately. I think you start off quite well describing the opening, the fact that it's talking about the extreme weather and the conditions that the characters are in, and then it moves on to talking about the coach. But you don't really talk much about the characters themselves and the way that it narrows down to focus on one character at a time and the relationships between the characters, or the fact that the last character that we see is the only one with a name before she then returns us back to the weather. You could have talked about the journey that they were on and the way it starts and carries on and ends, or the fact that it goes from it goes from outside to inside and then back outside again. So really I think we can only score 3 out of 8 on that one because it shows some understanding of the structural features, but really you would have needed to have made a few more points about talking about the characters as well as just the coach. If we now look at question 4, where you're asked to state to what extent you agree with the statement, the writer brings the very different characters to life for the reader. It's as if you're inside the coach with them. Although you've made some very good points here, I think if you'd have started off your response by stating whether you agree or disagree with the statement, it would have got you off to a really good start and would have focused your writing. You've made a good point about saying showing the man's anger by using sharp words like rogue, fury and murderer. However, you followed this up with 2 points that are not really relevant to the question because you've talked about the breakneck speeds that the coach is going and the conversation about it being a dirty night That's not really looking at how it's getting you involved with the characters. After that, though, you do move on to talk about the cake that the lady pulled out of a basket and make a good point about portraying a selfish woman, as they were probably all cold and hungry. In your last sentence, you've mentioned that the writer has been very descriptive in using adverbs such as fury, numb, and hoping. Unfortunately, these are not adverbs, they're nouns and a verb. So you do need to try and make sure that you're accurate when you're using the terminology. As this question is worth 20 marks, you needed to write much more than you have done, making several strong points about the characters. You could have gone into a lot more detail about the angry man and the way that his behaviour affects the other passengers, from the fact that he opens the window and leans out shouting at the driver, letting all the cold and the damp in, with no respect or regard for the other passengers. You could talk about the lady with the cake, who's obviously seen a lot of dirty weather in the past, as she describes it, finishing up with the quiet little lady in the corner, who's the only character whose name is mentioned, and the fact that she brings it all back to the weather again. Unfortunately, because you've not made a lot of points in depth, your score's been limited to level 1 with 5 out of 20. Which gives you an overall total of 15 out of 40. But as I said at the time, it was not to panic about it. It was just to give people a flavour of what the exam is going to be like and to just have a go at it. We will be working more and more on these questions, so you will develop the skills that you need. And we are running booster sessions on Mondays and Wednesdays as well, if you would like to come, if you're able. But as I say, it is a good attempt, and you will develop the skills and you will improve. So don't start panicking. I'll see you soon.